Hi, I'm Emily Rose. I'm one of the co-founders of Rebind.io. We're a site that focuses on the intersection of the performance arts, indie games, and sort of like AAA cult classics of yore. Um, I kind of finalized what I wanted to talk about today in the past few minutes, so you'll have to bear with me, but I think I've come up with something that the audience will probably appreciate. So I'm just gonna kind of go into it. It's a sort of heavy and lengthy thing, but I do believe we're having a Q&A after, so feel free to ask for clarifications after the fact. To outset, kind of summarize where I'm going to be going with this. So what we'll be touching on here is the next few notions, which is AAA indie and games functionality, challenges, and obstacles that face our industry. So I'm going to kind of start at the beginning here. Indian games media, whether they realize it or not, are retracing the steps of experimental theater, French film criticism, and French New Wave cinema. While beyond the scope of this talk, Jean-Luc Godard's origins and critique work in the magazine Cahiers du Cinéma, and later a film director with profound impact on the industry, demonstrates the media's capacity to not just analyze, yet also help shape the artistic lens of the future. We still feel reverberations of said magazine today as we grapple with concepts like auteur theory and criticism of our own medium. There's a clear time loop pattern of iteration throughout the past few decades of games. Those who have grown up in the shadow of mainstream and obscure titles and genres 10, 15 years after these foundational experiences often begin to revive and actualize their personal interpretation of these works as new artistic movements. Cult classics, failures upon release, become later revered visionaries, an exquisite corpse exhumed from yesteryear's cultural graveyard, taxidermied by these revivalist movements. Indie developers put into practice what indie and mainstream press curate from academic theory and critique. These experiments, when successful, generate momentum eventually introduced to the mainstream by AAA releases. A novel indie film trend, for example, many years later will begin to influence the trends in Hollywood as the novelty propagates until saturation, where it finally becomes a trope. Indie revivalists, such as retro shooters, retro lo-fi graphic trends, begin with the mainstream finishes through cultural fracking at industrial scale. Low fidelity graphics should instead be a stylistic toolkit that enables small teams to scale the ambitions of their predecessors who were limited by technical obstacles. North America, UK, Canadian, and Australian game scenes right now focus far too much on interdisciplinary disagreements, distracted by trying to reach artistic and industrial consensus. Unfortunately, by doing this, we're missing out on the innovations of our artistic peers outside our institutionalized cultural spheres, limited by geography. Like in the past, the artists creating these unnoticed innovations will be excluded due to cultural or geographical gatekeeping, and later exalted and mourned as visionaries or voices or cult classics halted in their prime. We manufacture artistic tragedy through our own self absorption, and we miss out on the opportunity to collaborate with global voices. And mainstream works or publications envy the wistful freedom of indies stumbling around in the dark. They admire them just as often indies and aspire to be or work against these institutions. There's an opportunity for cross-industry collaboration on such topics as reform and artistic innovation. Indies can take risks that AAA can't, and AAA can achieve scope and fidelity indie cannot. There is a way for AAA to harbor and cultivate this via grants or outreach, but indie needs to clearly communicate what they need and understand the business risks involved. We need to critically study things beyond narrative, critical code studies, for example, or other methods of criticisms that look at the holistic negative or positive impact of the medium's inner working. Without these critical studies or standards of care, we will risk perpetuating systems, ideas, or practices that are detrimental to our players, our medium, and our planet. We need to look towards theater, philosophy, and experimental narrative structure if we are to truly progress the medium. This means interfacing with and hiring things like dramaturge, playwrights, screenwriters, rather than relying on narrative designers to be a one size fits all solution to ludonarrative coherence and quest design. So I kind of went through that a lot faster than I intended to. But I kind of wanted to maybe expound on some of these points and further draw them out. And I'm glad I was at least able to condense and filter that all into something concise. So, for those of you not familiar with the website I'm the co founder of, we sort of began as a simple little ragtag team of a few people who really enjoyed playing small indie games, small garage titles, what at the time we classified as things like micro indies. It was this idea that we were seeing a lot of artistic innovation come out and be ultimately unnoticed, sort of buried in the like large stockpile of releases on platforms like itch.io or now even Steam. The main problem that we noticed were that really super brilliant titles were being released and just completely not talked about in the games press or media, and at most maybe finding, sort of a reverent following within its own fan base. We've obviously seen breakout hits come out of this. We've had Undertale, at least of the painful. One really good example comes to mind is the French RPG maker game Off, which is very noteworthy for its bountiful artistic expression and symbology. Uh, but these things often take years to propagate through the system by word of mouth and eventually manifest as what we later again acknowledge as a cult classic. So we wind up with the system where the artistic anchors that are guiding our industry are coming from the past and taking so long to propagate throughout that system that we lose the opportunity to again collaborate with them and grow together. It kind of leads into this vicious cycle of just culture fracking everything, digging through old comic books and old prototypes and small games of artists who may not even any longer be with us or perhaps have at the very least moved on to different industries because they didn't meet either the critical or financial success that they needed to maintain that momentum and pursue that career as a game developer. So we kind of have this existential struggle we're grappling with right now as an industry. And I don't think it's one of those things that we're all aware of, but we can't quite articulate how we're feeling or where this may be coming from. So our site was kind of a response to that. It was an attempt to improve upon these things. Mixed Media and I sat down and began to sort of like catalog our experiences, get our thoughts down on the paper, and create these bite-sized articles and later podcast interviews with various subjects that would help maybe begin to communicate the ways in which we connected with the medium and that might be shared amongst other people. At the same time, it gave us an opportunity to elevate or at least direct attention towards these artists who are contemporaries but are simply not reaching larger audiences due to being unable to navigate social media, press opportunities, so on and so forth. Uh, it is hard to say what kind of impact we have had, and I'm not really so much interested in that because there's plenty of wonderful, wonderful independent press outlets like ourselves out there now doing similar work. And I'm very happy and glad to see that. In fact, it's kind of led to a period of self reflection where I am kind of trying to figure out just exactly what the best direction for the site is right now. One of those directions, which we have been thinking about and working towards for a long time, is doing video essay format work on YouTube and further continuing the podcast series, punctuated by the occasional article release and, sort of longer form Twitter thread to draw attention to these games. The pandemic has certainly presented a lot of meaningful challenges in that department, and it's been slow moving as I myself begin to do work and tech and all over the place doing contracts here and there. So I don't have as much time as I used to have. Um, I think the big thing that I have noticed is that there is a real animosity sometimes towards different sectors of the industries coming from other ones. Indie feels like it is competing or working against the entrance of AAA when a lot of AAA people, again, actually admire indies. They miss that freedom, they miss that ability to experiment and navigate creative challenges without being weighed down by bureaucracy or business oriented agendas. Um, so, again, there is an opportunity for collaboration there, but if we can't communicate, we're going to really struggle with that. And it's interesting because the spheres of critique right now are often, we have this phenomenon in which your game can be a complete critical success. You can be a 10 out of 10. Everyone in the press, even on YouTube, can love you, and then you can be met with absolute financial disaster. You can knock it out of the park and yet still fail in this very material way. And the end result is, again, you're thrown into the creative graveyard. You're just something, a cultural artifact to be exhumed later so that the next revivalist movement can build off of your work. It doesn't seem like a sustainable system. It feels wasteful and it feels far too difficult for a new artist to navigate, and oftentimes even old ones. It also leads to a lot of reverence and romanticism for unhealthy systems of navigating creativity. We tend to put certain studios on a pedestal or certain narratives, such as, like, for a long time, we thought that crunch was something to aspire to, something to embrace, and that suffering made the art good. Uh, Now we are starting to come around and understand that it is actually destructive to the artistic process. But that's not the only component at play here. And we have to reflect deeply on why that may be. We also should perhaps reflect on what is the impact of written media and even video essays on the actual sales of these artists. Is it the word of mouth driving these cult classics to stratospheric success when they do finally break out in the mainstream? Or is it something else? Are we purely relying on influencers? Do the written press play a role? And if they aren't, how can we make it so that their voice is a little more relevant to market forces? Um, I think there is a need for all sectors of the industry to begin to build bridges with one another and collaborate beyond the occasional a novel piece of critique that circulates throughout the industry, both on the business and development side, and waiting for these things to trickle through is, again, just it's leading to a stalling out. We can't picture what the future looks like because it still feels like we're catching up with it. Uh, we They're being hyper fixated on what has happened before or what we think should be happening in the future. We're kind of missing out on living in the present. And we are, again, like, not paying attention to countries outside of the US, UK, and things like that. Southeast Asia has an amazing, like, fruitful indie scene that is blossoming. Um, India is producing some incredible work. Studio Liamingus is making some of the most, like, in my opinion, breaking, emotionally riveting, and just grabs you from out of the screen artistic experiences. And they are often talked about. And the only way that they're achieving any kind of financial success, if you can even say that that might be the case, I don't know for sure, is that they work in collaboration with museum and cultural projects funded by public sector funds. Which is another thing. We often have to use these public art funds to help bear the brunt of the risks involved with experimenting within our medium. So it's kind of an interesting crossroad, and we're not talking about it as a unified front. We are spending time having the occasional discussion and drawing attention to it sometimes through, again, commission think pieces and freelance articles where those freelance writers are able to slip something in under the guise of writing about a popular topic. Um, if I were to critique the media in a sense, it would be that the current system of relying on an army of freelancers to write pieces for, at sometimes less than minimum wage produces this pressure to make quantity over quality, and not only that, but the topics you're writing about are constantly a moving target. You have to somehow not only write something that is poignant and critical and analytically satisfying, you also have to find a way to link it to the contemporary trends. You have to slip in a socio-political piece as a critique of something like, Star Wars Squadron or Fortnite or so on and so forth. And is this exhausting gauntlet that freelance journalists have to run simply to survive. The only reason that we were in any way able to write about the things that we wanted to write about was we built a business model with an extremely low overhead, skeleton crewed it basically, and relied on essentially what is a glorified WordPress blog to manufacture the critique about the topics we wanted to write about on a topic that, frankly, like most people felt you couldn't be successful writing about at the time, which was indies. We were losing indie columns like flies all over the place. It was kind of disastrous. Now we see some of that coming back. John Walker's been able to start Buried Treasures. We have other wonderful sites out there that are now, again, drawing that focus back to indies themselves. But the only reason that we were able to do it and to maybe start to draw attention to those things again at the time where there was a gap in coverage was because we didn't put an emphasis on metrics. We didn't do advertising. We didn't pay attention to any of those things. We kind of just purely focused on, we're going to write about this thing. If we garner an audience, great. If not, no big deal. But we did make it an initiative to speak about these games and the fact that we were covering them and to try and draw eyeballs to it. For me, the success was really about if we could get people to pay attention to these games and to start connecting with them and being inspired by them. I did want to further also expound on sort of what I meant when talking about indie revivalists like retro shooters and retro graphics and things like that. I think lo-fi indie production is an extremely powerful, again, stylistic toolkit that allows us to do things in the aesthetic and gameplay realm of classic games that once again ran up to limitations. I struggle to think of an example off the top of my head, but I will instead use some interesting anecdotes, which is that it's kind of the famous tale of how Silent Hill's sort of like pivotally important visual fog came about as a function of a memory and rendering limitation. Um, so sometimes those obstacles to overcome can be good, but we have to remember that these older games, which we admire from our childhood and things like that, also cost millions upon millions of dollars to make the time. Like they were bleeding edge for their period. When we properly leverage these lo-fi aesthetics, we have the advantage that we can make things that are compelling works of art that have broad mass market appeal when done correctly, but can tap into these experimental mechanics that no AAA studio today could necessarily pull off, with some very few renegade exceptions. Death Stranding comes to mind. It is essentially a digital derive, a walking simulator brought to the mainstream. And to be somewhat financially successful at that, it's kind of brilliant in that regard. Same thing with Control. It suddenly brought something that had been stewing in the consciousness, I think, of indie games for a while, which is brutalism and an emphasis on sparse architecture and abstract philosophical and postmodernist concepts, and turned that into a quite popular and critically well received AAA third person shooter reminiscent of Resident Evil 4 with open world Metroidvania components. Like both of those are phenomenal, but they're kind of like the odd ones out because most studios would perhaps even pitch that to a publisher or investors to source that funding and be met with a brick wall of this is too risky, there's no precedent set for this. And we're very lucky to have these games, and those studios certainly feel lucky for being able to be in the position to make them. And they certainly struggled to get there. And we all know what happened with Metal Gear Solid 5 and Alan Wake, for example, for Kojima and Remedy, respectively. So I think again, we need to come up with a healthy pipeline that allows indie developers to explore these artistic niches and be able to find sustainable success. Just something that allows them to pay the bills and maybe turn a small profit so that they can merely keep contributing to the industry. I would love everybody to be have the capacity for every single person to be an indie rock star. um, but I don't know if that future is here yet. But what we can do is lay the foundation so that people aren't having to struggle and suffer just to contribute to an artistic medium that we all love and enjoy and also make money off of. It's a part of how we sustain ourselves, be it the fully employed press or people in the AAA industry. This is an ecosystem. We all benefit from aspects of what's happening here. So I'm hoping now that with the critiques being leveraged against things like crunch and overbearing work practices, both in indie and AAA, and also to an extent, the press realizing that what they are currently experiencing is also unsustainable, that we look to sort of reformed models of how to execute upon this better and to do so with a better consensus while also simultaneously being far more inclusive of diverse voices. Because unfortunately, the sad legacy of video games for the past 20 to 30 years is that despite being a medium that in a lot of ways owes itself and its existence to people of color, women, and gender diverse individuals, it has not shown that in who is elevated and celebrated. It is typically, white cis men. Um, there have been a lot of really influential individuals coming from the trans community. We've had, and this is true of film as well. We've had the famous composer springs to mind that I can't remember the name of offhand. Let's see. I'm just gonna look this up for a minute. It's worth naming her. It's Wendy Carlos is very notable for doing some really famous scores, and a lot of people don't even realize that she exists. And I think the same thing has been happening in video games. If I remember right, one of the first multiplayer games was programmed and made by a trans woman. I wasn't able to do enough research ahead of time of this talk because I've been so busy, but I hope this sort of draws draws the gaze of the audience to understand how their medium has been impacted by all of these people who are not represented in terms of the prestige and success that we get. We constantly look up to and revere studios like Blizzard or Valve or, you know, um, Epic and things like that, and we often lose sight of the people who are involved who made these things possible in the first place. So while we have made some strides in terms of award shows and industry events having, lifetime recognition awards, going back and sort of trying to right these wrongs of overlooking these individual contributions from these voices, it's taking so long. If we hand out one award every year to a woman who has spent the past 30 years making games into what they are today, it's going to take us a long time to get through the list of all the other people who would go unrecognized. Um, but I think we can do it in little ways every day. And part of that is a matter of liberating the press to speak about what they want to freely. Encouraging writers through more accessible business models to be able to write freely about whatever topic they want to pursue and explore. It's to, again, enable a sustainable lifestyle for indie developers so that they can produce innovative experimental works whose innovations will eventually trickle through the system and reach AAA mainstream titles. Um, we have to create that foundation. We have to recognize that this is not a monoculture. It's not an agricultural cycle where we just plant one crop and then next year we plant another. We have to treat it a little bit more kind of akin to permaculture. I tend to get lost in these like metaphors of the natural world, but I think they're relevant because it creates a more holistic system that I think is easier for us as human beings to interface with rather than a system of factories and products and publications focusing on spectacle and prestige. There are a place for those things, but they should not be the only model by which we approach this stuff. Because there are businesses' realities that we have to face down, and there are a lot of audiences that are perfectly content with how things are being produced as they are. I do think that there are a lot of questions throughout the industry as to whether or not the things that we do are healthy. A big topic on display has been, the role of violence in video games. Another one has been the role of gambling and chance in video games. Do loot boxes represent gambling? This is something that now, a couple of years ago was merely a topic of debate on enthusiast forums, and now we are finding it in the halls of our parliaments and our judicial systems and legal disputes that are playing out on the daily news. Um, and I think we need to have a better understanding of business literacy as a whole, even as avant-garde artists, and not only understand how we can use the system to our advantage and create that more sustainable daily life for ourselves, but also I think to maybe better inform our critique. I think too often we rely on being, how to put it, I think we rely too much on our gut instincts and strong emotions to guide some of our conversations instead of maybe analyzing these things from a systemic perspective where we get a truly full understanding of the gravity of our situation, the constraints we face. Because without that understanding, how can we possibly put together a list of action items to take small steps as individuals with our limited resources to change these monolithic, complex dynamics? Um, and I think too often we glorify and romanticize that sort of like little guy versus big monster narrative of just sitting there and going like we wait for a champion to show up and at the right time and the right place to flip everything on its head when we can just be taking those small steps every day to educate ourselves, educate each other, and also come up with pragmatic small incremental improvements to the systems we work in daily. This is kind of meandering at this point, so I'm not sure what the schedule is in terms of QA, and the event organizers may be able to interject here and let me know. But thus far, this is just kind of some observations I've made from writing about games for several years and working inside of them and navigating these systems. So yeah, not as cohesive as I would have necessarily hoped in terms of the commentary paired with the initial outline. But yeah, uh, do we have time for QA? I mean, we're at the 3:36 mark here.
Yeah, we have about 20 minutes for Q&A. If anybody has any questions, please throw them in the chat. Um, got a really interesting talk here, so
Thank you. Thank you again for having me here, and I'd like to just give a shout out of acknowledgement to my editor in chief and also my wonderful, beautiful wife, Mix Medea, for backing me throughout this whole project, being a huge source of inspiration, and being one of the founding voices of the project. Without them, I definitely wouldn't be where I am today, and I wouldn't even be able to have the thought to give this talk. So I definitely want them to be more people to go read their works and articles and check out because they have, frankly, thoughts I think that are deeper and more interesting than mine sometimes.
yeah, absolutely. We're glad you're here. We're glad Spencer could contact you to get you here.
Yeah. We also wouldn't be here without our wonderful audience who has supported us throughout the years. and all the incredible, wonderful people in the industry. I'm just a media critic. I have worked and created my own things, but like I really just want the focus and the lens and the emphasis to be on the people making the wonderful art that gives us so much to talk about. I assume that if we get any questions, it's going to be in the questions and answer channel.
Yeah, if anybody still has any questions, we can still throw them in the Discord. Otherwise, oh, we got one question from Josh in the Twitch chat. The indie game scene has become very competitive by sheer number of people making games. Do you think that this will dial back in the future?
I hope so, but I don't think it's a given. And I think the way in which we combat this is creating this more sustainable infrastructure. Without that, we're kind of setting ourselves up for fighting over table scraps. Some of this is going to be a matter of public arts funding. Some of this is going to be AAA reaching back and using some of their success to give grants. It's going to mean more access to investors and publishers offering fair and equitable terms, and also giving money for prototype funding, and more importantly, being willing to fund small projects. In the world of investment, $50,000 for a game budget is not very much. It's a drop in the bucket and sometimes not seen as like even worth negotiating for that little amount of money because it's not going to have returns at scale. But I think that kind of money could literally change the life of most of these garage indies who, most of the time don't see any more than a couple $1,000s in their bank account, if that. There are a lot of people who literally, have less than $100 in their savings and yet continue to make games on what is essentially a full-time basis. Um, I think what's important is to make sure that we do not steer this discussion amongst indies into a case of having to fight each other for approval and the validation of these institutions. We should be collaborating and unifying together. We should be having sort of a collective work to make this more sustainable. And it's kind of a case of that if we fight each other, we have no time to really advance the medium forward or to make better lives for ourselves. So I think also another core component to this is a crisis of curation, which I feel very strongly about. Um, Indie games are going to come off as very competitive when we only pick one rock star, one champion every year, and we give them an inequitable share of everything involved. Um, it's this case of we often hyper focus on one individual contribution or one game, and we go, "This is it. This was all that was worth talking about last year." And again, as I explained earlier, some of that is because of the media model forces freelancers to focus on whatever is trending in the moment to get the most clicks. And some of it is just a lack of access to funding, a lack of business literacy, and some of it is purely just like people not knowing how to navigate these monolithic systems, which is why I think those with the expertise and the success do need to reach out. And I would encourage those rock star mega hit indie maybe look back at the communities that they came from and start to seek out places where they can seed investment and grow more people like themselves to spread the wealth around and to encourage more success. A good example would be Superhot. They did Superhot Presents, and they took a lot of the profits that they made off of Superhot being such a hit, and they started throwing that at smaller games that were more experimental. Everything from visual novels to almost like Earthbound-like RPGs and other stuff now, probably. I haven't checked the project in quite some time, but
Wasn't Cluster Truck one of the games that they threw money at?
I believe so, yes.
All right.
And I do apologize. I live in a busy intersection, so I may have a siren going past here one second. But I hope that answers the question. I would like to see it be the case that this is not something that happens in the future, but we have to work towards that. We also, I think, have to stop trust falling indies. I think the issue was, we had Pathologic was a cult classic that we again exhumed from the cultural graveyard, and we kind of, in a sense, set up Ice Pick Lodge with the expectation of, oh, maybe we should return to this, maybe we should get investment and come back, and they poured a bunch of money into doing Pathologic 2, Pathologic HD, things like that. And then I remember that coming out to a lot of positive critical reception, but then not the financial success. So they kind of fell on their face again. And I know they're doing okay and they managed to make it work and to go from there, but it felt kind of like a cruel thing to witness as a member of the press, to look at that and go, there was this like sort of critical um, reverberation off the acoustics that made perhaps the demand seem much larger than it was. I think we're better off for having Pathologic 2. I'm certainly glad that that happened, but it would have maybe been nice if we could have put more financial support behind them. I don't know if you have any other questions we can move on to.
I had a question myself. With
Please.
uh, a lot of the industry today being mainly AAA, like kind of dominating everything, do you think in the future that will shift with indies becoming more and more powerful, or is it that kind of industry domination that makes indies into AAAs?
I think the distinction is going to blur a little bit. We already have triple I, or double A, however you want to put it. We have studios that I would consider to be indie, but in a different caliber of it. Uh, Kojima's endeavors, even though again having a lot of financing money and access to resources through Sony, and then also Remedy having had to strike it out on their own for a while and get sort of creative with funding to even make Control happen, and doing a big contract for Microsoft with Quantum Break to be able to afford to make something like Control. Um, I think it's the case that AAA is a lot less stable than people think it is. And I think it's the case that indie has a lot of power to do things like form cooperatives, form guilds, like Tailed Spinners over in the UK is a guild of narrative designers and writers that collectively pool their resources together so that they can navigate the business landscape despite working as individual agents. So I think it's a case of that the distinctions are again going to become blurry. I don't think AAA is going to be the dominant voice. I think it's hard to have those institutionalized dominant voices in the age of the internet and social media and things like that. But at the same time, I don't see indie taking the lead either, and it's going to be a multivariable, multi-layered schema of having to respond to not only market forces and trends, but sort of being able to predict what's ahead. And something I would like to argue for press, if there's anything I want people to take away from this talk, be they press, indie developers, or fans, or everything like that, stop being responsive to what the industry is already doing. If you want to just do something, if you want to just cover indie games, if you want to make a bunch of visual novels, don't wait for the perfect ideal conditions in the market. Just start doing it, because if you can make a sustainable business model for yourself to do that at length, whether that's having a day job, whether that's having cheap production values through lo-fi styles of production, you can set yourself up for success by the pure ability to just sustain yourself for a long period of time until you are taking notice. We didn't wait for the ideal conditions for a site to happen. We just started writing, and eventually we garnered an audience. That doesn't mean don't promote yourself and just work in silence and wait to be discovered, but just sort of don't burn yourself out. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Don't rush ahead with all of your energy. Piece it out, ration it out a little day at a time. Because undoubtedly, if you want to make something, be that good crit, be that a fun artistic project, or maybe you're a business developer who thinks you can make like a small like artist cooperative or whatever like that, you do have the advantage in that you can just start doing those things today. And if you want to do it, then no doubt there are people out there who are thinking the same thing or want to see that. And if you give them something to look at, they will eventually make their way to you and support you.
All right, thank you. Um,
Absolutely.
I think that might be all the time we have time for. Um, I guess, is there anything else you want to plug before we head off?
Yeah, I would say support your local indie media. Be that things like uh, gosh, I mean, there's a bunch of stuff out there. Cameron Kunzelman, who I know had a talk here. Errant Signal is wonderful. Kyle Cookshaw. There's just a bunch of people out there that are worth following and voices worth talking to. Yusef Cole, just a bunch of people. Diversify your media. Make sure you're getting a wide range of voices. Deal with a bunch of people out there. They're amazing critics doing great work out there coming from so many different backgrounds. And if you diversify what you're reading, what you're watching, then that will hopefully shine through for your work. And I'd say hire as diversely as you can as well. Get as many new voices into the scene. And that's not just a matter of people's, backgrounds of where they grow up in or who they are, but also, hire entry level people, hire rookies, hire, people from different industries and disciplines, hire filmmakers, hire, people who work in literature, theater. Bring all of those voices together, and you will be slowly pushing forward the industry into more progressive, interesting, innovative territory. And also, try to hire with empathy and understanding that people face different challenges from you. We live in kind of an era of, people having a lot of anxiety and frustration with navigating the daily obstacles of life. So not everyone has the same capacity for high standards of performance that we have learned to expect in this industry. So not everyone is capable of crunching, and crunching isn't something that you should aspire to do anyway. It's a failure state. So when you hire diversely, make sure that you're giving them the resources that they need to be successful because they're having to deal with a lot of things that you aren't. And you can sometimes unnecessarily perpetuate harm through those practices of just not paying attention. So I hope that's very helpful. But yeah, of
All right. Well, we want to thank you for coming again. Um,
course.
so I guess we will talk to you soon.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining and watching this talk.
All right.
Bye.
Bye bye.